Okay, so today I want to talk with you guys about why there are people at all. So we've been talking about free will, and at the end of our discussion of free will, I landed on this question about why are there beings like us who can make choices? The kinds of beings that can actually decide between alternatives, and we're not chained to the particles or chained to the laws of physics. We're not chained to external forces controlling our lives. If that's true, if that's right, then that means that we're a certain kind of being. And this leads to the question of how can there be beings like us? This is one of those questions where it points to something very familiar. Your existence, your reality, the existence of a person is very familiar. But familiar things aren't thereby insignificant. And the existence of people is very significant. And we're going to investigate that. Another reason why I want to talk about this now is that you can think of this as a kind of transition lecture that takes us between the topic of free will that we've been covering and this next topic we're going to be going into, which has to do with the foundation of everything. We're going to be talking about really the unit is on God. So we're going to be talking about whether God exists, what that word God even means. We're going to look at arguments for and against. And so we can think of this presentation as kind of a transition between the question of free will and the question of God's existence. So you can think of this investigation as an investigation into the hard problem of consciousness. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit for you. So first, what do I mean by a person? We want to know why persons exist. I got my draw pad here. There, that's a person. It's a very beautiful person. Here, let me see if I can do better. Slightly better. Okay, but that's not a person. Those are just shapes. That's just red pixel stuff. It's not actually a person. A person is something. I say a being, but then you might say, well, what's a being? So let's just say something, anything that is capable of thinking, feeling, and choosing. Okay, now when I say capable, I don't mean that it necessarily is thinking right now. Like maybe it's not thinking, or maybe it goes into a coma. It doesn't thereby cease to be a person, as long as it has some capacity or some power within it for thinking, perhaps later on, or feeling, or choosing. Okay, so that's generally how I'm thinking of a person. Let's say that that's a person or something like that. So we can kind of leave it a little bit open. So that's what I mean. It's the kind of thing you are, if you could think and feel and choose. So here's the hard problem. I mentioned the hard problem of consciousness. This is the problem of understanding how there could be something that could think, feel, and even choose in the first place, especially if you think that fundamental reality is ultimately non-thinking, non-feeling, and non-choosing. So how do you go from the non-thinking, non-feeling, non-choosing to thinking, feeling, and choosing? How is that even possible? So people have pondered this. David Chalmers, who coined the term the hard problem, he says or asks, why should physical processes give rise to a rich inner life? That inner life, the life that you experience within you. Why should that happen at all? The usual explanatory methods of cognitive science and neuroscience do not suffice. When it comes to the hard problem, the standard approach has nothing to say. Chalmers explains that the reason science cannot, in principle, solve the hard problem is that science can, at best, explain the functional role of consciousness, but it cannot explain why conscious experience should come to exist in the first place. So you can think of the functional role as a kind of uh, a sort of description of inputs and outputs. So you have certain physical inputs that lead to certain physical outputs. And what he's saying here is that merely seeing which input behaviors and motions lead to which output behaviors and motions, that's not going to give you that inner experience, that inner life. And he's wondering how the inner life could arise, how that could emerge in the first place. Jaegwon Kim says, and this is in his book, Physicalism or Something Near Enough. Oh, well, I guess it's in Mind in a Physical World. But he's got different things. Actually, I thought this was in his book, Physicalism or Something Near Enough. So Well, anyway, you can check the source. Here's what he says. He says, what is becoming increasingly clear from the continuing debate over the mind-body problem is that currently popular positions are not easily tolerated by robust physicalism, where physicalism, again, is that you have this sort of foundational reality that's purely physical, and from the physical comes the mental. And you look at the different theories of consciousness, different theories of the mind, it's hard to see how that's possible. Michael Huemer, he said that the hard problem of consciousness is, in my view, a major, perhaps the major challenge to our fundamental worldview, and it would require a major worldview revision to resolve the difficulty. As far as I can tell, no philosophical theory has come anywhere near to solving this problem in any coherent and vaguely plausible way. And Huemer, he's one of my favorite philosophers. He is clear-minded, and it seems to me that he demonstrates an interest in really understanding what's true about things. And so I really appreciate him. But I want to just point out that none of these philosophers are coming at this from a religious perspective. Chalmers, Kim, Huemer, none of these are religious philosophers. In fact, they have expressed skepticism of the existence of God. And so it looks to me that they're just wrestling with the question of consciousness, and they're just thinking about how it's possible for consciousness to come to exist. So they're not just trying to kind of rationalize their belief in God or something like this. It's rather that they're just facing the reality of consciousness and wondering how this is possible. Okay, so how do we solve the hard problem? I mean, how do we explain how persons come to exist? And I'm going to talk with you about 4 different solutions, and I'm going to just consider these solutions with you and kind of point out some of their strengths and weaknesses so that you can think about all the options out there. So the first solution is what I'm going to call eliminate persons. This is the eliminativist solution. This is a real position that people have held. I was kind of surprised actually when I got to graduate school just how many people were suggesting that perhaps there are no conscious persons at all. This is sometimes called eliminativist materialism. The idea here is that there is matter, but there are no minds, thoughts, or feelings. All right, I forgot that I can draw here. So here's a person. And like I said, that's not really a person. Those are just red pixels. But I mean, you have a physical structure that might look sort of analogous to this. And somebody could look at that and say, hey, you know what? Actually, that's just a physical structure. That's just shapes and motions. That's not, there's no mind there. There's just particles and atoms and things like this. You think that you have thoughts, but you don't really. I mean, that's just the common folk, thinking things. To think about this philosophically, and you can sort of see that that you don't have thoughts, feelings, or emotions because all there are just physical, particles that come together to form people. But actually, they don't form people. There aren't any people. They just form machine-like things that act and function as if there's something more there. Now you might wonder, like, why would somebody really think this? And I want to say that the people who think this, the ones that I've met personally, are good people and very reasonable. They have got some important points to make about this. And there's a lot we could say about this, but one reason that people sometimes give in support of this, somebody I was talking with in particular expressed this to me, was that our knowledge through scientific observations is really the most secure knowledge that we have. So science gives us information about the world. Through this information, we make technologies. We could see that science works. And it looks like what we find out about a person's brain when we do scientific investigations is that there's dark matter, gray matter, there's patterns of particles in there, but we never actually find that first person experience. Okay, you see like molecules and stuff like this, but you're not able to detect the feelings, the hopes, the desires of that person. Science tells us about the brain activity, not somebody's inner mental life. You don't get those inner conscious thoughts, feelings, or choices. That's not what you see through science. And there is sort of this challenge of the hard problem. How would you account for thoughts, feelings, and choices purely in terms of the material. And so perhaps the solution to that is just say, well, there aren't any thoughts, feelings, or choices. So scientism is roughly the view that all knowledge comes through scientific observations and analysis. You can add analysis in there. So you can use logic, and you apply logic to empirical evidence. Empirical evidence is evidence that you could detect through those five senses we've talked about, through seeing, through feeling, touching, and you can create devices that can detect things, and then you detect those devices through those five senses. Okay, so a question, it's sort of a natural question to ask, is scientism itself based upon scientific observations? How do you know that all knowledge comes through scientific observations? We've talked a lot in this class about your many powers to know. And this is one of the reasons that I talk about this so much, is because if you limit yourself to just five powers, five senses, then there's all sorts of things that you are unable to know. I don't think that you could know that you have inner thoughts and feelings just through your five senses. I mean, I suppose maybe you could posit a thought to explain your behaviors. I suppose you could do that. But how do you even know what a thought is? What are you positing? That inner sense, that inner subjective experience looks like that's something you detect through that introspective power, this light of awareness within you by which you can see that you have thoughts, feelings, emotions, desires. Okay, so eliminativism eliminates your inner light of awareness, eliminates your introspection, because that's something that you detect introspection through introspection. If you think about that, you actually see that you are able to see your thoughts and feelings, but you're not seeing them with your eyeballs. You're seeing them through this inner awareness. And you see that inner awareness by that same inner awareness. You apply the light to itself, in a sense. By introspection, you can know that you are real just by experiencing your own thoughts, feelings, and choices. So, this is not the most common solution then to the hard problem. Most people would say no. Most people think people exist. And so let's consider another solution. Another idea is that you might derive persons from non-persons. This may be one of the most popular uh, solutions or viewpoints, frameworks that philosophers of mind are working with. And so we can think about this. I just want to point to a few challenges here. We've talked about the puppet problem, the problem of accounting for moral responsibility if all of your actions are chained to particles and forces beyond your control. And remember, we drew out an argument that doesn't depend on whether everything is determined or indeterminate. So the argument was that whether everything is determined or indeterminate, if the controllers, whether they act deterministically or indeterministically, if those controllers are controlling all of your behavior and you don't have control over the controllers, you don't control the laws of physics. The particles act according to the laws of physics, either deterministically or indeterministically. And those particles, they existed before you existed. So you can't just say, well, those particles are me. And these controllers control your behavior. If that's right, it's hard to see how you could be a genuinely morally responsible being. If if everything about you is derived from impersonal forces. So that's a challenge. Now, it's not to say that there aren't any possible responses. We talked about the possibility that maybe there's a way of accounting for your genuine responsibility in a way that's compatible with things being controlled by uh, these controllers, these kind of deterministic control of you. But there is this kind of challenge, there's this kind of intuition that if you don't have the ability to be the first mover of your actions, then you're not genuinely responsible. Okay, so that's something to consider. Now you might wonder, how do you know that you are responsible? Well, here you got to use all your powers to know. So we talked about your power to detect within you your own sense of responsibility, and that sense you might think is evidence of your responsibility. And so if that's right, if you are sometimes responsible for your behavior, then there is a kind of puppet problem of deriving everything about you purely from non-personal elements. And second, there's what I have been calling a construction problem. How can mindless dead matter construct a living conscious person? I mean, think about this. Some constructions are just impossible. For example, you can't construct a squirrel by just adding a bunch of numbers together. Like take 2 plus 2 equals, there's the squirrel. That doesn't even make sense. And it's not like you just need a complicated enough number. Complexity has nothing to do with it. It's not like, well, make the number big enough, then we can make a squirrel, or get enough numbers together. It's like, no, no, no. Numbers are just the wrong ingredients to make a squirrel. And I think you can just see this through reason. I think reason just reveals something just can't happen. You can't make a square circle. You can't take a bunch of squares, add them up to make a squirrel. And if that's right, then we can consider whether constructing consciousness from non-consciousness is even possible, whether there's just a construction impossibility there, or construction error, you might call it. So think about the things that you have to construct within your consciousness. There's rationality. So you have the conscious experience of thinking through something. Well, can your thinking through something rationally be derived from purely non-rational elements? Or is that an impossibility? So consider that, right? I mean, I'm inviting you to think about this for yourself. Think about how that seems to you. Think about whether it looks like there's a construction problem there. First-person conscious states, can they come from purely third-person non-conscious states? Like if you take some sand and you just carve a sad face into it, does that sand become sad? Could it become sad? Like, is it even possible just by changing the shape of something that you could make sadness, real first-person conscious sadness? Is that possible? What about moral decisions? If you can decide between paths, can that come from non-moral motions? We already talked about this. This is a part of challenge 1. In challenge 2, it's not just a problem of control, it's a problem of construction. Is it even possible to construct a choice from non-choices? Does that even make sense? And then if you have intrinsic moral value, you might think that there's something wrong with just killing people, and it's worth protecting people. In fact, some people have suggested that you can derive our whole moral system from our desire to survive, human desire to survive. And all morality really is pinned down to this. Well, but why? Why is this desire even worth, you have that desire, but is that desire, let's say that somebody desires to kill you, and you desire to stay alive. Are these desires just equal, or is one desire better to have than the other? You might think, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the ethical unit, when we talk about ethics, but you might think that people have a kind of basic or intrinsic moral value. Well, is this derivable from purely valueless motions, or things that don't have that intrinsic basic moral value? You might think that's just a construction error, like adding up numbers to make a squirrel. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not proposing that everything is equally clear. Okay, so you can see some things with different degrees of clarity. I mean, have you ever had the experience of maybe adding up some numbers, and then you think that they add up to something, but you're not 100% sure? Maybe you check it with a calculator, and maybe you were right. So you can have degrees of clarity, and I think that the clearer something is, the more likely it is that you're going to be right about that. So you can check each of these constructions and ask, well, is it clear? Is there some evidence here from your own mind that this is a possibility or an impossibility? So that's the basic challenge with deriving persons from non-persons, and this challenge has led philosophers to consider other solutions to this hard problem. Oh yeah, I wanted just to point out, you might think these constructions are impossible, but you could think that the constructions are possible, but still think that they're not thereby probable. This is an important distinction because a lot of times when people are thinking about getting consciousness from non-consciousness, they're thinking purely in terms of what's possible. And sometimes they'll say, well, maybe it is possible. I mean, after all, there is consciousness. And if you think that the ultimate reality is fundamentally non-conscious, non-mental, then you're going to think that it is possible. But there's another question, which is this even probable? Okay, now I'll just tell you, for me, I am skeptical that these things are even possible. It's even possible in principle to derive persons purely from non-persons. But if that is possible, it still isn't thereby probable that given a random configuration of non-persons, persons will eventually come forward. I mean, even if the universe is infinite, you could have just an infinite sea of impersonal forces forever. And there's no sort of guarantee or probability that persons will ever arise. So it is striking, how is it that there are persons? Sort of a striking thing. Okay, so you might anticipate that I'm going to propose maybe you can derive persons from persons. They don't come from non-persons. Well, what else could they come from? They come from persons. I keep forgetting that I have the power to draw things. And I'm going to just keep drawing people because I don't know. Let's see. Let's say that this person, here, this is you. And you are created from something else. All right, maybe your parents work together and they do some magical things and somehow they produce you. Soul comes from soul. Okay, now you might think, oh, there's just a purely physical process. Well, it might be that there's a physical process that's tied to a soul process, just like we talked about how your brain states and your mental states, your thoughts, feelings could be connected. And that very connection, there might be a law-like connection. And that very connection is itself a reflection of a thought. You might think that. Or whatever it is, there's some kind of law that connects the physical and the mental. So there might be something similar here that souls can produce other souls through some kind of process. So in any case, we can just leave that open. The idea is that non-personal forces aren't the whole story. It's like if you saw water coming from a rock. It's not purely the rock that explains the water. Okay, it might be that there's water flowing through that rock from another source. So in the same way, if you come to exist, your consciousness, maybe that comes from some prior consciousness. And even if there's physical processes aren't the whole story. So what do we have here? We've got somebody else. Let's just say persons. Okay, but now can you see a problem actually? I mean, if persons come from persons, you can always ask, well, where do these persons come from? And of course, the answer has to be persons. Okay. And you might think, well, hey, maybe there's some God back here. But it's that the solution is that persons come from persons. So either God is personal or not. If God's not personal, then that contradicts the solution because then you have a person coming from a non-person. If instead God is personal, well then according to this solution, that means God comes from a person. So God has God's God. And we're talking with some people who had this idea that each God comes from another God. Anyway, I don't want to get into that so much, but this is going to lead to an infinite regress. And so, I mean, that's kind of a challenge once you think about this, because then it looks like you have no ultimate explanation of persons. We still haven't explained why there are persons. Why is there this entire chain? Why is there this? Why not instead a chain of just particles? Okay, or let's say just nothing at all. If you want to have an ultimate explanation of persons, and each person in that explanation, each person, okay, is itself something that cries for further explanation, then there's a sense in which merely linking them together in an infinite chain just leaves something important unexplained. It leaves unexplained why reality isn't instead just particles or just nothing. Why we have this reality. So, although solution 3 might have been tempting, I don't think it's going to be the best solution. We haven't explained why there is this infinite chain of persons in the first place. Why not just mindless particles forever and ever? Why not just nothing? Okay, here's the final solution I want to consider with you and And I think this sort of exhausts the options. I mean, just think about like, either there are persons or not. Okay. The first solution is that there are no persons. If there are persons, either they come from non-persons or they come from persons. If they come from non-persons, then you've got the hard problems, accounting for the construction problem as well as the problem of accounting for responsibility, deriving the responsible from the irresponsible or non-responsible. So these are challenges. If you say that persons all come from persons, you got to have the infinite regress problem, and really you just don't have an ultimate explanation of persons. So here, let me propose that instead, there's at least one person that's fundamental. Okay, so we could draw this here. There's sort of a foundational mind, let's say. And from this foundational mind springs forth both material complexity, perhaps, and, well, it's not part of the theory that the mind produces the material complexity, but I'm just kind of filling this out, as well as, let's say, material complexity that includes a tie to persons like us, other persons, dependent persons. So this mind is a non-dependent foundational person from which dependent persons, if there are dependent persons, arise. Okay, so now, I mean, you didn't think I was just going to give you this solution as a problem-free solution. There's still things to think about here. So one thing that you might wonder is like, how could a foundational person construct matter? You could think of this as a kind of reverse construction problem. I mean, if there is matter here, if matter has a hard time producing mind, then would mind have a hard time producing matter? So you might think there's a kind of symmetrical problem. Now, let me just say for my own part, kind of how when I think about this, I don't really see that this is exactly symmetrical at all, really, because first of all, I'm not really quite sure what matter is. So, I mean, sometimes people think, well, it's clear that there's matter. What's unclear is what a mind is. But I think that has it backward. I think that my mind is something that I can see within me, my thoughts, my feelings, emotions, and that's actually very clear. And when it comes to matter, matter is something that I posit to explain my pattern of experiences. Matter isn't something I sort of see directly within my experience. So if I see, um, you know, a chair, let's say, that chair is ultimately made of smaller particles, and those smaller particles are made up of, I guess, let's say, the most fundamental particles. Well, what are those things? I don't really see them. I posit them to explain what I do see. And some people have been suggesting that these particles are fundamentally informational in nature. And in other words, they are themselves sort of like mental elements, thought-like elements in their own nature. And if that's right, well, then you don't really have this reverse construction problem because you don't have mind producing something that's fundamentally non-mental. Mind is producing information, and information can take the form of matter in our own experience. And of course, our own experience is also a mental experience. Okay, so that's something, just when I think about it. And so I'm not sure that I really have a good grip on matter. I'm not sure that it's symmetrical. But then there's something else, which is it has to do with the kinds of things in the mind that are to be produced, like rational thought. It seems when I think about it, like a rational thought, if I have this picture in my mind of like a tree branch that's just randomly blowing in the wind, carving stuff in the sand. And imagine that the tree carves a message, I love you, and my love for you is perfectly rational. Okay, now if the carving of that message was itself determined by completely non-rational forces, it's hard for me to see how the message itself would be rational. It seems like it would just be random, not rational. But if the message is itself rational, then it makes me think that the cause is rational in some sense. And so there's something there about getting the rational from the non-rational that just seems to me to be a deep problem. Whereas when I flip that around and I imagine a rational mind producing scribbles that are not themselves rational, that seems possible. It seems possible for a rational mind to even just aim at something, maybe even to do something that is rational, like aim to go to the store or something like this. but the exact sort of, let's say, how should I say this? The exact uh, path to the store, it's rational with respect to getting the store, but it's not rational in the sense of itself being a message. So somebody could look at that and say, hey, that's not a rational message. It's not rational sort of through and through, or rational in every respect. So you can have a rational mind produce rational effects that are also have some non-rational elements. So anyway, I don't want to say too much about that, except just to kind of leave this open in a way that there is this reverse construction problem, and kind of make progress, one wants to think about whether it's completely symmetrical to the original problem. So is it the case that getting mind from non-mind is symmetrical to getting non-mind from mind, assuming there are non-mental elements? Okay, and then another challenge you might anticipate is just this question about whether there could be a foundational person. Could there be something like that? Does that really even make sense? I mean, you might think that the persons that we are aware of in our experience aren't foundational persons. Although, how do you know that, right? I don't know. I mean, people speculate about all sorts of things when it comes to their ultimate origins. Uh, so, I mean, there is the idea that, well, you started in a physical form, but that was the start really of your consciousness in this form. Doesn't thereby follow that that was your ultimate start. So you can sort of think about that. But this might seem strange, and again, we've talked about your way of looking at the world being kind of through a lens of your worldview. And so if you think that ultimate reality is ultimately impersonal, then this view is going to sort of be in conflict with that worldview. And you might wonder if you can make sense of this, how you can make sense of this. So these are things to think about. Okay, so let me just wrap this up and offer you some conclusions. First, the existence of persons like yourself, that's a very familiar thing. You wake up, there you are. You are aware of yourself. This morning I woke up and it's like, oh, here I am, awake. So very familiar. But don't mistake the familiar for the insignificant. You are very familiar, but you are not thereby insignificant. In fact, I think your existence is so significant. Just pondering how reality could include a being like you can really help you to think about the kind of reality that you live in. So that's my next point. Thinking about persons can help you understand the fundamental nature of the world you live in. Somehow, the fundamental nature of reality has to have the resources somehow for allowing persons to come to exist in some fashion. And that says something. That says something about ultimate reality. Has those person building resources in some way. And so that's not just trivial. That's not insignificant at all. I mean, it'll have implications about the meaning of life, the purpose of life, why you're here, the significance of your life. Understanding the nature of the world can affect how you live. I mean, remember that first solution to the hard problem of persons, which is that maybe there aren't any persons. Well, that eliminativist solution, that will imply something about you, namely that you're not even real. And if you don't really know that you're real, will you take the time to take care of yourself? Will you care for yourself? Now, it might seem kind of silly, like, well, of course I'm real, but beliefs sort of come in degrees, and also they depend on focus. So if you have a focus on external material reality, and you think that that reality, whatever it is the most real, and the internal private thoughts and feelings you have, that's not really there. If that's, and again, as this comes in degrees, it's like you may not pay attention to yourself. You may not give yourself the attention that you need to give yourself to really take care of yourself, to take care of your thoughts. I mean, I can just tell you this personally. Sometimes I get a little bit lazy and distracted and lose sight of the things I need to manage within myself, and then something will sort of test that. And am I ready? Am I ready for the test? And this can get very practical because you can actually prepare your mind, prepare your thoughts, prepare your emotions so that you're more powerful in your life. You can do that. But this is going to depend on your view of the nature of reality. Are you real? So let me just close this by giving you my view. Now, my rule for this class is my number one rule is don't believe anything just because I tell you, but check it for yourself and see if it makes sense to you. But I think it's helpful for me to be authentic with you sometimes, and well, all the time, but to sometimes just tell you what my view is, and you don't have to agree with this, but this is what I think is true based on my own depth of consideration. So I think that your life is not a product of mindless particles. Instead, I think your life is a product of purpose. I think the fundamental nature of reality is personal, includes purposes, includes some basic purposes that are linked to its sight of the good. And that good is built within its nature because it is good. And because it's good, it loves good things. And you are a good thing, so it loves you. What that means is that your life actually matters. And I think this is a test. I think we all experience a test in life of various kinds where we're invited to be heroes in our life for others. We're invited to be a hero for ourselves. We're invited to have courage. But heroism, courage, these are things that shine gloriously and brilliantly in the soil of test, of pressures against you. And I think one of the tests is actually a test about whether to sort of give up in life or whether to think of life as fundamentally meaningless. I think this is one of the tests. It takes a certain kind of work to see meaning and purpose in things. And not everybody has to see the same things. Not the same things aren't relevant to everybody. But to see the things that are relevant to you, the things that are relevant to your purposes, it takes a certain kind of work. So I hope this is helpful for you to at least frame the types of views that one can have and some of the main considerations, at least as an introduction for you. Let me know if you have questions and comments or pushbacks or objections. I would love to see that from you guys, and then I can interact with you, and hopefully we can have a conversation about this. Hope you guys are doing great. Thank you. Bye.